Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Since 2013, Bombas has donated over 100 million socks, underwear, and T-shirts to those facing homelessness. If we counted those on air, this ad would last over 1,157 days. But if we counted the time it takes to make a donation possible, it would take just a few clicks. Because every time you make a purchase, Bombas donates an item to someone who needs it.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Hello folks, welcome to Naval Month on the Napoleon Assist, as voted for by my Patreon supporters. I've got a quick favour to ask. If you enjoy the episode, drop a like, subscribe, and how about sharing or leaving a review? It'll take you a few seconds, but it makes a huge difference in helping to reach a wider audience. As ever, if you're interested in going even further to support the podcast, check out the links in the description to discover how you can become a supporter, the perks that are involved, and how you can leave a one-off tip. Thank you all for your incredible support as we close in on 75,000 downloads, and enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to the Napoleon Assist and yet another installment of Naval Month. Today we're going to look at a significant figure in the history of the Royal Navy. But no, it's not Nelson, because we're not being predictable. I am joined by Paul Martinovich, who is the author of The Sea is My Element, The Eventful Life of Admiral Sir Pulteney Malcolm, 1766 to 1838. So you've guessed who we're going to focus on today. Paul, great to have you on. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, and it's very good to be part of your podcast.
That's very kind of you to say. Normally people just go, oh yeah, I'm fine, and don't compliment the podcast. So thank you very much for that. It's much appreciated. Let's start logically with Malcolm's early life. So a career in the Navy is one of those that generally appealed to what you might call the younger sons. But Pulteney comes from a particularly large family, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He came from a family of 17 children. He was the third son and sixth child, so you could call him the younger son. There were a lot of others in that category in the same family.
But that's a very big family. What kind of impact did that have on his early childhood? Or was it kind of one of those things where it's just a case of, we need to get you out of the house and into a profession, preferably the Navy ASAP?
Well, certainly the latter. Obviously, in a family of 17, they're not all present in the house at the same time. The first cohort have gone before the later ones are on the scene. But it did cast a strong effect over his early and sort of middle career, mainly because of the financial problems that resulted from such a large family, considering his father was not a wealthy man by any means. His father was a tenant farmer and farm manager in the lowlands of Scotland, near Langholm in Dumfries. And the initial years of George Malcolm, his father's career, were fairly prosperous, and they did quite well. And then the children started coming, 17 children in 20 years. And it obviously became more and more difficult for him to maintain his family at any kind of level of economic prosperity. Added to that, George Malcolm made a very unfortunate financial investment. He started importing wine with some relatives, Madeira from the island, of course. And that went quite well until 1778, when the war broke out with France, and the wine-owning classes suddenly decided they couldn't afford to pay for this luxury item. And the bottom dropped out of the wine market, at least as far as Malcolm was concerned. So unfortunately, he'd signed some personal loans that he was now due for, and they were a source of real problems for the rest of his life. And so that brings us to Pulteney, because Pulteney and his brother John in particular spent a lot of time in their first 20 years of their careers trying to get out from under these debts, pay their father's debts, and get into a financial stable position. So that's, the long and the short of it.
So is it that they felt obligated to pay their father's debts, or was there actually just a kind of a hereditary obligation that, once I'm not sure when the father passes away, but is it a case of, it passes on to the next of kin, and so therefore they had to pay those debts? Or was it kind of a familial ties kind of sense of obligation?
I think it was a family obligation. I don't know that there was any legal requirement for the sons to take on the father's debts, but they certainly felt an obligation to clear these, and they did just before George died in 1803. So they succeeded, but it was a bit of a struggle.
Is that an indication of a close family unit?
It is indeed. The children of George Malcolm and his wife, Margaret, usually called Bonnie Peggy, were an extraordinarily close family, despite the size of the family. And this can be seen by the fact that Pulteney Malcolm always felt that the family home at Burnfoot in the Lowlands was really where his heart was. And he corresponded with his sisters throughout their lives. The five of the sisters lived there for most of the time. And he corresponded with his parents, obviously, when they were alive. And he spent his summers there when he could. So it was a very close-knit family, very affectionate, and it was at the center of his life.
I'm already starting to like the sound of this individual, somebody who's fundamentally kind of a family guy. I hope that kind of continues as we start to talk about his other relationships. So he has an eventful career, let's be fair. One of the particular curious things that piqued my interest is his trip to Manila Bay with Captain Edward Cook. So tell us a bit about that.
Yes, this is one of the highlights of Malcolm's career, even though it occurred fairly early on. The context is that in 1797, word reached the Indian Ocean fleet that the Spanish had changed sides, and the Spanish were now allies of the French. At this time, Malcolm was commanding a small frigate called the Fox in the Indian Ocean. And the fact that the Spanish had changed sides drew the attention of most of the senior officers in the Indian Ocean for two reasons. One was that a force of Spanish warships in Manila would be a real threat to the China trade, the ships coming from Canton through the South China Sea to get to India and eventually to Britain. So that needed to be taken into account. The other factor was that in 1762, during the 7 Years' War, Britain had taken Manila with a combined expedition. And as a result, the senior officers had become immensely wealthy. And this did not pass unnoticed amongst the senior officers in the Indian Ocean in 1797 and 8, when people started to think, well, perhaps we could do that again. So that's the context. The immediate circumstances were that Cook and Malcolm were to take their two frigates and convoy a group of China ships north through the South China Sea to Canton, wait for them and bring them back. This was a standard part of the work of frigates in the Indian Ocean. They managed to get permission to in the course of this work, to take a look in at Manila Bay to see what was going on. It wasn't very clear exactly what they were going to do or how they were going to do this, but nevertheless, the commander-in-chief of the Indian Ocean, whose name was Peter Rainier, acquiesced to the suggestion from the two captains that they take a look at Manila. So they hashed up a scheme to get the information they needed, which was basically how many Spanish ships were in Manila, what state of condition were they seaworthy or not, and what were the defenses and the troops in the area like. All information that would be relevant to any potential combined operation. There was also a rumor that there was a Spanish treasure ship in Manila, and I have no doubt that this also was one of the factors that got Cook and Malcolm interested in taking a look in and seeing what they could stir up in their activities. So the way they decided to do this was that they were going to fool the Spanish. They were going to disguise their ships as French ships. The Spanish knew that there was a French squadron in the area, and take that as far as they could in terms of fooling the Spanish to the point at which they would give them unsolicited the advice, the information they needed. So apparently, they certainly flew French flags. The officers, both Cook and Malcolm, spoke good French, which helped. The officers on board the ships wore some version of French uniforms, and I have a feeling that they did something to the ships. They painted them or something to make them resemble French frigates. So they sailed into the Manila Bay, past Corregidor Island, and anchored just offshore, as you would do if you were a visiting pair of warships. And out came the boat with the port officials and the customs people and so on. They came aboard and they were greeted by Malcolm. The Fox was the first into the bay, and so that was the first ship that the Spanish approached. Malcolm greeted them in French very hospitably, and within a few minutes, Edward Cook came aboard as well in his pseudo-French uniform, and the pair of captains took the Spanish down to the captain's cabin and entertained him for an hour. And they had a nice chat and some wine, and all the time the British captains were pretending to be French and bringing it off. They made it work, and they got the information they needed. They found out that there was in fact a Spanish squadron in the port of Manila, but it was not seaworthy. There'd been a typhoon, and the ships had been damaged, and they weren't going to be going to sea anytime soon. At this point, another boat came out from the city with another group of officials, and they were also welcomed on board. But it was clear at this point that there was not much point in continuing this ruse de guerre. So Cook and Malcolm announced to their guests that, oh, by the way, we're not French, we're British. This is a British ship. The Spanish were dumbfounded, to say the least. But they kind of took it in, I won't say good heart, but they didn't really have much choice. They said, oh, that's unfortunate. But it all sort of turned out well in the sense that the Spanish were let go. They didn't keep them captive. There was no real point. During the course of these discussions, the crew of the two ships had taken three gunboats that were anchored nearby, and they became prizes. But the three or more Spanish officers were all sent back on land, and they may have even given them some dinner. It's not entirely clear, but anyway, that there was a fairly friendly exchange, and the Spanish were released. So that the British captains got the information they needed. There were no blows exchanged. It was all very civilized, and they sailed out of the bay and on to other duties. So that was a pretty astonishing accomplishment, which received a lot of play in the Indian newspapers, in the British newspapers in India. But to my surprise, when I looked at it, it wasn't even mentioned in the British newspapers. And the reason is because it took 6 months to get the news home. And by that time, there'd been the Battle of the Nile and all kinds of other um, extraordinary pieces of news concerning the Revolutionary War. And so it was just so old that despite its sort of astonishing nature, it didn't get a lot of play in the newspapers.
See, this is what I've loved about Naval Month. All the way through, we've just had revelations and stories like this that are just, you almost couldn't write them. And if you did, people would go, oh, that's ridiculous. That would never happen. But they do. This is staggering. I mean, dressing themselves in French uniforms and disguising the ships, was that strictly legal? Were there, because to put it into an army context, if you were caught in a uniform that wasn't your own, you could be shot as a spy. So were there certain risks involved in doing that? Or was it a case of, well, we expect to be there in force anyway, so it'll probably be okay?
As far as I can tell, there was no strong legal sanction against this kind of activity. The strong legal sanction was you couldn't fire on an enemy ship under false colors. But I'm not aware of, and I haven't seen anything in the accounts of this event, that the dressing up in somebody else's uniform and pretending to be them was in fact illegal under the laws of war.
Just astonishing, genuinely astonishing. And these brilliant stories just keep on coming. Now, he ends up missing Trafalgar, and it's important to emphasize that he just misses Trafalgar. But this is quite a remarkable story in itself, isn't it? Because when the news arrives that the Franco-Spanish fleet are leaving Cadiz, his ship is, for all intents and purposes, in pieces, right?
Yes. This is another important moment in Malcolm's career. In fact, it's so important that it's the moment I chose for the image on the front of the book. In October 17th, 1805, he was sent by Nelson to do some minor repairs at Gibraltar, get some casks repaired that were leaking, and pick up some supplies. On October 21st, the Battle of Trafalgar was fought, at which time his ship was sitting in Gibraltar with the gunpowder out of it, the topmast down, the casks being repaired, and basically in no way could it go to sea. So over the next 24 or 48 hours, he and his crew made incredible efforts to put the ship back together. He knew that there was a battle. There had been a small ship come in and say the combined fleet are exiting Cadiz. He knew there was going to be a battle, or had already been a battle, and any additional ship would be very welcome on the spot. So his efforts were extraordinary to get the ship to sea, which he did on the 22nd. And then even more extraordinary were his efforts to get out of the gut of Gibraltar. That's the narrower opening between Spain and Morocco, where the Mediterranean flows out of the into the Atlantic Ocean. The problem was that the wind was dead against him, and the current in that area is also from the west to the east. So he was trying to get to the west, and it just wasn't working. There were a number of merchant ships that turned back. They just couldn't get through, but he made it through by very skillful seamanship, basically. He arrived on the scene of the battle on the 23rd of October, 2 days after the battle, and then started about 2 weeks of intense work rescuing ships that were adrift, because there was a gale was coming up, and the storm after Trafalgar had great effect upon both fleets and the prizes that the British had taken. So the result was that even though he wasn't on the spot, he did an immense amount of work after the battle to help the ships that were damaged, to get prize crews off ships that were sinking, and basically to help clean up the aftermath of this enormous event, and was recognized by Collingwood for this extreme activity.
How, I mean, to put a ship back together in 24 hours, given what you've said, it's a remarkable kind of thing. Had he needed to go into action, how kind of well prepared was the ship? Because, did they have to kind of bodge things back together to get themselves to sea? Was this in some respects a kind of, well, we're not going to be in a good situation to fight, we're not going to have the ability to maneuver as well as we'd like, but we're needed and so we've got to go? Or had he turned up and there had been a battle, would he have been able to maneuver the ship and fight as effectively as he would have liked?
No, it's pretty clear that the status of his ship, which was called the Donegal, after he'd put it back together, was a fully fledged fighting ship. There wasn't shortcuts taken in order to get to sea. He's just done everything faster than normally, about 3 or 4 times faster than normally. The one thing that does occur in a number of accounts of this is that it's said that he put to sea towing his foremast, or not his foremast, but his foreyard, one of the major elements of the rigging, beside the ship in order to put it up to hoist it up to place while en route, rather than waiting in order to get that done before he set out. But the log doesn't actually support that story. But it seems pretty clear that his ship was fully stored and ready for action, and he was expecting to actually fight, I suspect, when he got to the scene, if there were French or Spanish ships that needed to be taken care of.
It's astonishing. Is this typical of the guy? Do we kind of see this sort of do things incredibly efficiently, be ready to do your duty pretty much at a drop of a hat? Is this just what he does? Absolutely.
He prided himself on the speed at which he got things done, and the adjective that was often applied to him was zealous, and that's a word that means, in this context, speedy, thorough, attentive to orders, and very, very competent. And so that was Malcolm to a T. He was always on the lookout for ways in which he could get things done as faster. And in fact, he even confessed to his wife at one point that he tended to make decisions quickly, even when he didn't have to make speedy decisions, he'd make a speedy decision. So that was his personality. That was the way he did things.
Is he unique in that respect, or is he, part of a certain breed of Royal Naval officers who go on to do great things for the army?
I don't think he's unique. I think he had this quality in sort of to a large extent, but there were other officers who also, I think, had the same kind of outlook on their duty, and as a result, were very successful and well known for their skill and ability to get the job done when it needed to be.
This is really quite incredible to hear, and to me, this speaks, or it suggests, that he's actually quite a capable motivator. Because yes, as an individual, you can be very good at making these decisions, but putting a ship back together in such a circumstance, that says a lot about your ability to motivate a crew to do all the relevant tasks, do them efficiently, and get things shipshape, pardon the pun, in a time span that is just really quite astonishing. So let's dig into his style of command. I mean, apologies to regular listeners who know that I will shoehorn discussions of discipline into any conversation going. But what's his style like, just on a general level, first of all, and then we'll talk about discipline very specifically?
Well, we have the advantage that we actually know quite a bit about the way in which he commanded his ships, because there's a letter from one of his lieutenants to John Malcolm, his brother, that describes the situation in 1810 when he was in command of the Donegal, the ship of the line. And that letter sets out an interesting view of the style of the captain. He's zealous. The lieutenant says he's actually too good for a captain. He should be an admiral. But in the way he commands his men, he's not a tartar, not a flogging captain by any means. In fact, the lieutenant thinks that he's a bit too lax with the men. He does tend to shout a lot. He's shocking noisy, according to the lieutenant. The Malcolms all had loud voices. In fact, Pulteney Malcolm actually nearly caused a international incident by laughing too loudly during a diplomatic affair. So it sounds as if he shouted quite a lot to direct his men. But Wright, the lieutenant in question, goes on to say that he never used abusive language, which was pretty common in the Royal Navy, as you might imagine. And once he reprimanded somebody, he never mentioned it again. If they did what he wanted, that's fine. It was not held against them. He was careful to ensure that his sailors were active and had things to do. He ensured that they competed with their fellow sailors on other ships. The kinds of things that today we'd say create unit cohesion, that get them to feel that they're all part of a team and that the team is all pulling together in one direction. He gave leave as much as he could to his sailors, and that was a sensitive point in the Royal Navy, given the rates of desertion. And he didn't even bother to ask the Admiralty whether he could give leave, he just gave it. So that made the sailors very comfortable on the ship. And the Lieutenant Wright says that there were very few who would have traded this situation for any other because of the humane way in which Malcolm commanded his men. And it got the ship the nickname the Happy Donegal. It was renowned for the happiness of the crew and the effectiveness of their work. So he was a very effective man manager. I think that's clear to say.
Yeah, that's, again, the more you tell me about this guy, the more I'm deeply, deeply impressed, because he's doing a lot of things that others in the army particularly are saying, look, this is how you should do it, but then trying to get people to follow through on that is something else entirely. Do you see his style being copied? Are there sort of conversations about, look, we know what's happening on the Donegal, this is working, we need to replicate that? Or is it just a case of his domain being run his particular way, and they're just kind of being a rumor mill, if you like, that what Malcolm does works?
That's an interesting question, because in fact he addresses this himself in one of his letters to his wife, and says that basically this is not the kind of thing that can be done by everybody. It needs a particular kind of personality. He didn't quite phrase it this way, but that was his conclusion. And I think he was probably right. I think that while the ship had the nickname the Happy Donegal, it didn't become a model for other captains because they weren't comfortable with this degree of relaxation in commanding the crew, and they were bound by more traditional modes of command that perhaps were set down by the Admiralty or they'd been trained in as young men. So I'm not sure I would say it was unique. There were certainly other captains who were similar in their approach, but it wasn't a case of him setting up a model that then was widely imitated.
And whilst you're talking about his wife and we're talking about the guy as an individual, what's his relationship like as a family man?
Well, I mentioned his close relationship to his siblings, which continued throughout his life. But in 1809, he married Clementina Elphinstone, who was the daughter of Sir William Elphinstone, a director and often four-time chairman of the East India Company. So a very important and wealthy person in the establishment. And Sir William Elphinstone was the brother of Lord Keith, who was the senior admiral afloat in the Royal Navy. So if you were looking to nab an appropriate or a wife who was going to do you some career good, this was as good as it gets. But in fact, it's clear that that's not why he married her. And he'd known her for some time, and they'd become close friends, and eventually they got married. And neither of them were very young. Malcolm was 40 and Clementina was 34. And he also became very close to her family, the Elphinstones. Not so much Lord Keith, who was a difficult individual, but Clementina's parents and her brothers. And so he called them his second family, and he lived with them when he was in London because he didn't maintain his own house for himself and Clementina, being at sea almost all the time. So he lived, when he was in London, he stayed in the Elphinstones' house. And his closeness to his wife is demonstrated by the number and frequency of letters that he sent to her over the years. And those are the basis of the book that I wrote, that in them he expresses both his opinions and events of naval nature, but also on all kinds of other matters, which the two were discussing at a distance, as it were, via letters, and his opinions on a whole variety of social matters, that some of which are predictable and some of which are not, but always reveal his closeness to his wife and his thoughtful approach to matters of the day.
Is there any indication of what her life was like? Do we have letters going in the opposite direction?
Short answer is no. Unfortunately, only perhaps a half a dozen letters of her have survived, and that's a shame, because it would be really interesting to see. She was an intelligent woman. She knew a lot about the Navy. She met and knew many of the officers, independent of Malcolm, because of her father's place in the East India Company. And she had opinions which occasionally were different than Malcolm's about the worth or lack thereof of certain officers. But unfortunately, very few of her letters survive.
What a pity. Now, this is Naval Month, but I am going to indulge slightly in sort of the Peninsular War obsession that oozes through this podcast, but in a justified sense this time, because Pulteney is involved in the transport of the British Army to Portugal in 1808, and then subsequently had to testify at the Convention of Sintra. Talk us through his involvement there.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom, like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Well, as your listeners will probably know, the beginning of this process was the British government's desire to send an expedition to South America, to Venezuela, what's now Venezuela, commanded by Sir Arthur Wellesley. That was being set up in early 1808, and then the Spanish rebellion broke out, and for a host of reasons, it became inappropriate to try and detach a piece of the Spanish Empire, but it also became appropriate to send troops to the peninsula to support the Portuguese and Spanish in their war against the French. So Malcolm happened to be on the spot. I don't think he was specifically chosen for this role, but he was available. The force was at Cork, gathering and getting supplies and so on. So he was appointed to essentially take the troop ships with the 10,000 men that Wellesley commanded to Portugal and land them somewhere. And the somewhere was up to Wellesley and Sir Charles Cotton, who was the fleet commander on the spot, to decide. So that's what he did. Basically, Wellesley selected Mondego Bay, which was where the Mondego River came out to the sea in Portugal. And Malcolm's job was to get the troops ashore as safely and quickly as possible. It wasn't an easy task because even though there was no resistance from the French, and the weather was good, the surf was immense on the shore, and there was a bar across the river at the Mondego River, which prevented the ships from moving up into the river where it would be easier to land. So it took 5 days to put the troops ashore. They used both boats from the fleet and local boats crewed by Portuguese sailors who knew the area very well, and basically got the whole army ashore with almost no losses. During this time, Malcolm worked very closely with Wellesley. As you can imagine, Wellesley was on board the Donegal for some of the time. And because they knew each other from many years before, and there's a long story that I won't go into how they did, but in any case, they were very, they worked very well together. Unlike some cases where the naval and military commanders would be at odds, Malcolm and Wellesley were very easy, found themselves very easy to work with. The troops got ashore. Wellesley, of course, gathered them up and set off to meet the French. And then several more flights of troops came from Gibraltar and from England. And Malcolm maintained the same role. He was the man on the spot who got the troops ashore, ensured that they got their supplies. And in addition, he sort of acted as a clearinghouse for Wellesley, because as each group of troops appeared, they had a general with them, and the general got information from Malcolm about what the situation was and up-to-date intelligence on the situation on the ground, and thus was ready to, when he went ashore with his troops, to join the growing British Army. So that this took place, as many of your listeners will know, over the next month or so. And then they, after the Battle of Vimera, the senior officers took over from Wellesley, the senior army officers, and the Convention of Sintra was signed. Wellesley talked to, at least via letter, and probably in person, to Malcolm about this and expressed his uncomfortableness with the conditions. But Malcolm wasn't a party to it because he was a naval officer who was a little more junior than the army people and not involved in the negotiations. But when the inquiry erupted, where the British government decided to look into the circumstances of this apparently unfortunate agreement, Malcolm was called to testify, and he did so. His testimony wasn't all that relevant. It was mostly to support Wellesley's position, and particularly the idea that Wellesley had carefully selected Mondego Bay, and that this was our appropriate place for the troops to land. The larger issue about the conditions under which the French had been returned to France, that was not something that Malcolm could speak to. But Wellesley was very pleased that his friend Malcolm had supported him, and in fact offered him a place to sleep when he was in London, just because they were friends, and also because Malcolm had been so hospitable on his ships when Wellesley had voyaged on them and needed a place to sleep. So it reinforced their friendship, and Malcolm had done a very good job, and I think it was recognized widely, of getting the troops ashore and of ensuring that they received all the supplies and reinforcements that they needed.
What surprises me ever so slightly is, Wellington, Wellesley as he was back then, he's one of these people who likes people who can do a job well. Malcolm's somebody who does a job incredibly well. Is there any indication that when it came to operations further into the Peninsular War, Wellesley, then Wellington, was kind of making requests about, can you send me Malcolm? He was good. I'd quite like somebody of his caliber.
That's an interesting question. I have not seen anything that suggests that. As you know, Wellington worked with in various degrees of success with various naval officers, especially along the north coast of Spain in the succeeding years of the Peninsular War. I'm not aware that he asked for Malcolm at any point. Malcolm was tied up, as it were, with blockading Cherbourg for much of the next few years, and may have been considered by the Admiralty to be too important in that role to be essentially seconded to the peninsula. The other thing is that Malcolm commanded a ship of the line, and really for the purposes that Wellington needed ships, they needed to be frigates. So his ship was really too big for that kind of work. That's an interesting question, but that's as much as I can say about that.
And when it comes to the War of 1812, again, Malcolm ends up being a key individual, doesn't he? Particularly when it comes to the assault on New Orleans.
Yes. It started off when the war ended, or apparently ended, in April 1814 in Europe. The powers that be decided the British Army needed to be, at least some of it needed to be sent to North America to reinforce the forces there. And Malcolm was given the job of taking 16 troop ships from Bordeaux to the Chesapeake, where there had been ongoing raids and attempts to annoy the Americans for the last year and a half. And he did so, arriving in the Chesapeake in late summer of 1814. He landed, the troops that he brought and the troops that were already there were landed and took Washington, where incidentally his brother, James Malcolm, who was a Royal Marine, was a major, not major in the sense of rank, but an important senior officer during the taking of Washington and the burning of the Capitol and so on. But Malcolm wasn't present at that event. He was back on the ships in Chesapeake Bay or in the Patuxent River. And then after Robert Ross, the general, had taken Washington, Ross was a good friend of Malcolm. They'd traveled together on the Donegal on the Royal Oak from Bordeaux to Bermuda, and both men found each other to be very compatible and became good friends over the period of time. Ross and Coburn, the admiral, and Cochrane, the more senior admiral, decided to take Baltimore. Baltimore was a hive of privateers and seemed to be open to perhaps to the same kind of assault that Washington had been. Malcolm did the same thing he'd done with Washington, which was to land the troops, ensure that the forces were in the right place at the right time. And he even went up to accompany the troops up towards the fortifications of Baltimore, because he really wanted to see a land battle. He says this to his wife, and it's clear that his wife was very dubious about this ambition, but that he wanted to be present when his sort of colleagues did their thing, and see how that went. As it turned out, he decided he needed to get back to his ships, and an hour later, Ross was killed. And the assault on Baltimore didn't really take place. There was a battle, but the walls of the city were not breached, and the British decided they were going to back off and try and get there, take the city by bombardment as opposed to by storm, and that didn't work either. So he was a central figure, but not a sort of a visible figure, in the sense that he's working, getting the troops ashore, getting the supplies and horses from ship to shore and back again when they had to get back on board, but not sort of present at the big events. At this point, the excuse me, the attention of the British turned to New Orleans, which Fortescue, the historian of the British Army, claims was because the Royal Navy was really keen on prize money, and New Orleans was a great big pot of gold waiting for their attention. And Fortescue's even more sarcastic about Scott's naval officers, and claims that they, amongst the greedy naval officers. The Scots were even the most greedy. And this is sort of inappropriate. While Cochrane, the senior naval officer, may well have been interested in the prize money, it's pretty clear Malcolm wasn't. He was pretty tired of the war by this time. He really just wanted to get in, get out, have the Americans surrender, or else make peace and get on with it. In any case, the British sent their large proportion of their troops to New Orleans. Malcolm took them there in the troop ships. They decided to attack the city, but they couldn't go up the Mississippi because it was too winding, it was too well defended. So they came up with an audacious scheme to use Lake Bourne, which is a kind of a lagoon off the ocean that could get them to within 10 miles of the city, and take boats. Because Lake Bourne was very shallow, you couldn't take ships there, but they would take the troops in boats, land them on the swampy shores south and east of the city, and then work their way up towards the firm land where they would have the basis for an assault. And so Malcolm was involved in this for about 6 weeks. And during that time, he was out of his ship. He says that he was camping in a tent on swampy ground for almost all this time. And it was December, so it was cold and it was wet and there was sleet. And the British got the troops up to New Orleans, and they could have even probably captured the city if they had made an assault as soon as they got the first lot of troops up. But they decided to wait for reinforcements. And so Pakenham, Lieutenant General Sir Edmund Pakenham, arrived with a full set of engineers and artillerymen and so on, and set up a plan for an assault on the city, which involved a frontal assault on the American lines and a simultaneous end run across the Mississippi in boats. And the idea was that the British troops crossing the Mississippi would take the American batteries that were on the other side and cause their direct their shot against the American lines at the same time as the British troops attacked. And this involved a lot of work on the part of the sailors, because they had to get the boats into the Mississippi, across the Mississippi. And Thornton, the colonel who was in charge of this operation, to get him and his troops apt to where the American batteries were. So the process started on the evening of the 7th, and they rapidly found that it was going to take much longer to get the boats across the Mississippi than they had expected. There were all kinds of problems, and basically they had to be hauled. The boats, 47 boats, had to be hauled across 250 yards of mud to get to the Mississippi, and it took many hours longer than they'd expected. They did it. Malcolm says that he'd never seen sailors work so hard in his whole life, and he'd seen a lot of activity and seen sailors in all kinds of circumstances. But the problem was that by the time Thornton and his men got across the Mississippi, the attack had already taken place. Pakenham didn't wait for the other shoe to drop, as it were, but went ahead with the frontal attack, and it was catastrophic, and the British were mowed down by the Americans. And so the whole thing failed. So then Malcolm's job was to get all the soldiers back again, including 1,000 wounded. There'd been about 1,000 dead and another 1,000 wounded from the force of 8,000 or 9,000 that had been brought to New Orleans. And so it took 2 weeks to get them back the same route they came, down the creeks to Lake Bourne, across Lake Bourne, and into the ships. And at the end of this time, Malcolm was exhausted, as was just about everybody else. But he felt that he'd done his duty as well as he could, and he was probably right. And he was praised by everybody as a result of in the official dispatches. But of course, he was not happy with being associated with such a catastrophic event.
I'm not particularly surprised given the nature of his career up until that point. I want to talk about his career after the war, because you talk there about what sounds like a certain war weariness by the time of the New Orleans, I think, debacle is a fair kind of way of describing it. But he's one of those who manages to stay on in the Navy. So what does he end up doing? And I'm very conscious that the simple answer to this is really quite a lot.
That is correct, yes. In 1816, there were about 180 admirals in the Royal Navy, of whom Malcolm was one. He'd been promoted admiral in 1813. And there were just 12 jobs for admirals in the nature of things. That's what there was. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of competition for these 12 positions, even though of the 180 admirals, some would be too old or too uninterested in further seagoing careers, but there were lots of them who wanted to continue and to distinguish themselves in peacetime just as they had in war. Malcolm being one of them. So his first job was, he got it, I think, because of Lord Keith, that Lord Keith, who was the senior admiral and advisor to the British government, tapped him to be commander-in-chief of the Cape of Good Hope, which the most important element of which was St. Helena and Napoleon. And so after his predecessor, Sir George Cockburn, had left the Cape and St. Helena, Malcolm arrived to essentially command the naval forces that were defending the island and preventing Napoleon from escaping. And this is the area in which Malcolm may in fact be known to some of your listeners. He became friendly with Napoleon. I mean, if anybody can be said to be friendly with Napoleon, which is hard to say, but he met with him 17 times, often alone or with only one or two people. There were long discussions on a whole variety of subjects. And this was all written up in a book that was published in late 19th century. So he handled himself very well in this kind of tricky position, because it was Sir Hudson Lowe, the governor of the island and commander of the army forces, was a difficult character and at odds with Napoleon, and Malcolm tried to mediate between them and at the same time keep his own integrity and maintain some kind of decent relationship with the ex-emperor, which he did, but he didn't really succeed in resolving the differences between Lowe and the emperor. So that lasted about 15 months, and then he went home and was on half pay as a essentially in semi-retirement for the next 10 years. And my sense is that towards the end of that time, he became quite desperate to get a job. And there are some begging letters from him and his brother John to Wellington, to asking Wellington to see if he couldn't put a word in at cabinet to get a job for Pulteney Malcolm. He was trying for various positions, one of which was a port admiral at Chatham. At one time, he thought he might get the job of being on the Board of Ordnance, which provided guns and gunpowder to both the Army and the Navy, but nothing succeeded. And then in 1828, he had a lucky break, and that was that after the Battle of Navarino, in which the British fleet, in conjunction with the Russian and French, had destroyed a Turkish Egyptian fleet on the south coast of Greece. The British admiral commanding Sir Edward Codrington had been recalled. The British government was a bit unhappy with this event. They called it an untoward event. And Codrington was, I think, unfairly blamed for this and other matters about which he had little or no control. But in any case, he was recalled. They needed another commander-in-chief Mediterranean, and Malcolm got the post. And it was one that he was really suitable for. St. Vincent, the crusty British admiral who was a patron of Nelson, had many years before said that in peacetime, the Mediterranean needed an officer of splendor. And I think Malcolm matched this description very well. He worked with both his French and Russian colleagues. The French and Russian fleets were still present in the Mediterranean, to try and get the Greeks and the Turks to agree to an approach which would allow a Greek nation to be created. Codrington had laid the foundations with this and done a lot of the work, but it was still all up in the air when Malcolm arrived. And so he spent the next 3 years, the posting was a 3-year posting, working with his colleagues, the diplomats, to get this done. At the same time, trying to restrain the Russians from being overly ambitious in the Mediterranean, and keeping an eye on the French, who were the sort of traditional enemies and might go into Egypt again. And he had a lot of fun doing it, by the sound of it. He really enjoyed this post. And he got to meet the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the head of the Turkish Empire, the ruler of Egypt, who was an astoundingly interesting individual, Capodistrias, who was the head of the Greek forces, and many other diplomats and military men who were involved in this kind of whole messy business. So at the end of that time, he came home. Unfortunately, his wife had died in the meantime, so it was not a happy homecoming, but he soon plunged into more posts. In fact, he was given more seagoing posts than any other officer of his time in peacetime. And I think that's because he got on very well with the First Lord, who was, by this time, was Sir James Graham. The Whigs had taken over from the Tories. So he got to be the commander of the experimental squadron, which was given the job of testing out new hull forms and rigging approaches. He was sent to Ireland to keep a lid on the Irish Catholics in the South who were protesting against the tithe laws, aid to the civil power kind of thing. Not a job that he relished, but one that he did effectively and without any violence. And then he got another break in that his successor in the Mediterranean died in office, and they needed a replacement, and Malcolm was again sent to the Mediterranean and essentially finished up the work that he'd begun before, several years before. And so his record during the peace was, as I say, probably the most active seagoing officer of the time. And he was very successful. Only at the end of his time in the Mediterranean did he have a bit of a run-in with the First Lord, but overall, he essentially did what the British government wanted and enjoyed himself into the bargain.
Which leads to a kind of inevitable question to end on, which is, you tell the story brilliantly in the course of your book. Why do you think history hasn't really been told until now, though? Is it just the case of, Nelson factor and it eclipses everything?
That's part of it. Nelson tends to sort of take the oxygen out of the room, as it were. And that I noted in the book that there's a sort of nicely visual expression of this in an early edition of the Illustrated London News. Shows a picture of the statue of Malcolm that was put in in St. Paul's Cathedral after his death by his friends to represent this eminent sailor. And on the same page, there's a bigger picture of Nelson's column, which is going up at the same time. So yes, Nelson sort of tends to overwhelm things. I think there are some other factors at work, one of which was that for much of his early career, at least, Malcolm was in the East Indies and was out of sight, out of view of people at home, the newspapers and so on. So he wasn't visible to the sort of general public. Another is that he didn't have a Victorian biographer. Many of the the naval officers who became well-known were well known because they had a relative or friend who wrote their biography after their death, sort of life and letters. For reasons that I don't quite understand, his son, who lived a very long life, did not do that. And there are no other relatives who took this on. So even though he was very well known and in the newspapers and famous in his time, 50 years later, his name had sort of fallen off the historical chart. And the result was that there's no previous biography of him. He's mentioned in passing in a number of books and certainly in a number of memoirs at the time. He was because his personality was so interesting and attractive, a lot of his colleagues mentioned him, but nobody wrote his biography. So I think that both the Nelson factor and the fact that he didn't have a biographer in the Victorian period are part of the reason for his apparent invisibility.
Well, I'm delighted to say he does have a biographer now, not least yours truly. So The Sea is My Element, The Eventful Life of Admiral Sir Pulteney Malcolm, is available from Hellion. As I'm always telling you folks, please go and buy it from Hellion, not from Amazon. Jeff Bezos spends your money on rocket fuel. If you buy it through Hellion, then Paul will get a cut of the royalties, and it will be far more substantial than what he'll get if you go buy it through Amazon. Do go buy the book. If you want to go buy through Amazon, go buy through Amazon. But if at all possible, please go buy through Hellion and support the brilliant authors who make these fantastic podcasts happen for you. Paul, thank you ever so much for this. Please tell us that you're working on something now, and that I can have you back and we can talk more naval stuff or something else equally fascinating in the future.
Yes, I have a couple of things that I'm working on, in the sense that I'm trying to decide whether there's enough information to do a biography. There are many, many interesting individuals of this period in the Royal Navy, and it's a sort of a task to find the ones that have both the good story and the documentary background to make them work.
Brilliant. And are you on social media?
Not Twitter, but I am on Facebook.
Fantastic. So folks can keep an eye out for your work there. Paul, thank you ever so much. This has been absolutely fascinating.
Well, thank you, and I enjoyed doing it.
Before you go, do me a favour. Like, subscribe, share and leave a review. It'll cost a couple of seconds of your time, but it makes a huge difference to the algorithms which push this podcast out around the world. If you're interested in becoming a supporter, you've heard my spiel on this often enough in previous episodes, but essentially everything gets reinvested into growing the content, from tech upgrades to new kit aimed at bringing you more variety to the show. There are perks for regular supporters. Check out the Patreon link for more on that. But if that's not for you and you want to leave a one-off tip, you can do that via Ko-fi. Each hour of podcasting has anything from 4 to 6 hours of time poured into it, so your support in whatever form it takes, financial or digital, is hugely appreciated. A particular thanks to my Emperor level patrons Mark Stoos and JC Kaiser, my Commander patrons Ger Brown, Jane Davis, Bob Burnham, Marcus Cribb, Matt Bone and Zach Golby, and my mentioned in Dispatches patrons Jeff Maple, Ed Koss, Indiana Fats, Mark Dewhurst, Jim Getz, Stephen Coulson, Colin Fieldhouse, Ryan Diamond, Alexandra Lyon, Josh Keeney, Gareth Copeland, Ross Flowers, Jim Deary, Lucy Tatner, James Bevan, Rory Muir, Lynn Dawson, Beatrice de Graaf, Anna Vakulenko, John Haynes, Brendan Teeling, an anonymous Canadian, Alex Churchill, and Rob Griffith. Join me in a few days when Naval Month will continue. But until then, I'm Zach White. This has been The Napoleonicist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Thank you.